Somewhere in Craigieburn, on Melbourne's northern fringe, there's a 62-year-old grandmother who found a dog. Not her dog, someone else's, wandering, and she did what most people would do. She kept it safe and figured out where it belonged. The man who came looking for it wasn't interested in a conversation. He punched her in the face. The next day, two men turned up at her house. One of them was carrying a pistol. They told her, plainly, not to go to the police about what had happened. That's not the headline crime in this story. It's barely a footnote in most of the coverage, but it tells you more about who Beau Hewat actually was than almost anything else in his file. Because this is a man who, by the time police finally moved on him properly, had been offending for more than 40 years and had risen to become the sergeant-at-arms of one of the most notorious chapters the Hells Angels ever ran in Victoria. The Enforcer. The man whose job, formally and informally, was discipline. And in October 2013, that whole structure, the towing business, the Mickleham property, 4 decades of staying one step ahead, came apart in a single, coordinated morning. If you want the full unravelling, stick with this one. It's got more turns in it than the headlines ever let on. And if pulling records like this apart is something you want more of, a subscribe genuinely helps keep it going. To understand what collapsed in 2013, you need to understand what Hewat had actually built. He wasn't some low-level associate who'd wandered into serious trouble. Court reporting later described him as someone who'd been committing crimes for more than 40 years, a career that stretched back long before most of the detectives eventually assigned to his file had joined the force. He ran a towing and heavy haulage business out of Craigieburn, on Melbourne's northern edge. The kind of business that, on paper, explained cash, vehicles and industrial equipment moving through his hands without raising immediate questions. He lived on a property in Mickleham with his wife Sheridan and his son Beau, and within the Hells Angels East County chapter, he held the position of Sergeant-at-Arms, the office responsible, in outlaw motorcycle club structure, for discipline and enforcement inside the club itself. That's the man Victoria Police had been building a picture of for years before they ever laid a charge that stuck. The picture that eventually emerged wasn't just about one bikie running one business. It was about how deep a single figure could embed himself into both sides of a community. Legitimate enough to have a company name on the side of a truck, connected enough to have men with a pistol turn up at a grandmother's house the day after a dispute over a dog. That incident deserves more than a passing mention because of what it reveals about scale. This isn't a story about drug empires or gangland executions. It's a story about a stolen, or at least misplaced, dog, and how quickly the response to something that small escalated into something armed. According to the allegations later put before a Victorian court, Hewat punched the 62-year-old woman in the face after she'd found his dog and refused to simply hand it over. The following day, 2 men arrived at her home. One was armed with a pistol. He told her, according to the allegation put to the court, not to go to police about what had happened. She was facing, in that moment, exactly the kind of choice this series has documented over and over across different countries and different organizations. The choice between reporting something to a system that's supposed to protect you and staying quiet because the people threatening you have already shown they know where you live. The charges that eventually followed from this incident were serious: stalking, intentionally and recklessly causing injury, making threats to kill, attempted aggravated burglary, and, in an unrelated thread that got folded into the same set of proceedings, trafficking in the drug ecstasy. A grown man, a sergeant-at-arms with 4 decades of offending behind him, escalating a dispute over a dog into an armed home visit. That's not incidental colour. That's the temperature at which Beau Hewat operated. October 2013. Victoria Police had spent months, if not years, building toward this moment through what would become known as the Echo Taskforce, a dedicated anti-bikie unit stood up specifically to dismantle exactly the kind of structure Hewat represented. On the day itself, police carried out coordinated raids on Hells Angels properties across the state, statewide, not just Hewat's patch. His Mickleham home was searched, so was his towing business in Craigieburn. He was one of 13 people arrested that day, out of what would eventually stretch to almost 60 raids on the outlaw motorcycle group and its affiliated clubs across Melbourne. What they found in Hewat's case produced 17 separate charges: 2 counts of possessing a drug of dependence, specifically anabolic steroids, 4 charges of handling stolen goods, 1 count of theft of a motor vehicle, 2 charges of possessing a prohibited weapon, and running through all of it, the proceeds of crime question that would define the months of court hearings still to come. $47,000 in cash found at his Mickleham property that police alleged was the product of criminal activity rather than his towing business. Hewat, at 58, didn't apply for bail at that first hearing. He was remanded in custody. And police made it clear publicly that they expected to lay further charges as the investigation into the raids continued. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the opening of it. Here's the detail that turns this from a standard drug and weapons prosecution into something considerably more pointed. During the Craigieburn raid, Hewat is alleged to have said something directly to the officer leading the investigation, Detective Senior Constable Gary Measham of the Echo Taskforce. "I believe families are now on the line," followed, according to the allegation, by "fair go." His defence barrister, Shane Tyrrell, later told the Victorian Supreme Court that Hewat had simply been referring to his own family, that the words were being read into something they didn't mean. Justice John Dixon, hearing the bail application, wasn't persuaded. He found that Hewat's words to the detective could reasonably be interpreted as a threat, and he refused bail on the basis that Hewat posed an unacceptable risk both of reoffending and of interfering with witnesses. It's worth sitting with what that specific finding actually represents. This wasn't a judge weighing up whether a man might commit another crime in the abstract. It was a judge concluding, on the evidence in front of him, that a senior Bikie figure had effectively signalled to a detective investigating him that the officer's own family could become part of the equation. That's the specific weight the word Sergeant at Arms was carrying in this case. Not a title on a patch, but a demonstrated willingness to make things personal for the people trying to hold him accountable. Hewat's legal team pushed back hard, and it's worth giving that pushback its due weight, because it's the argument that ran underneath almost every hearing that followed. Shane Tyrrell told the court plainly that his client was being targeted because of his association with the Hells Angels, not because of any specific criminality, that detectives were, in his words, attacking Hewat on all sides. He pointed to something specific, that police had apparently arranged for local council building inspectors to visit the Mickleham property to check whether the house even conformed to building regulations, seemingly to test whether Hewat and his family should be allowed to keep living there at all. The fact that he is a member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club, Tyrrell told the court, is the reason that he has been charged. The $47,000 in cash, Hewat maintained, was legitimate proceeds from the towing and heavy haulage business, nothing more sinister than a cash-heavy trade dealing in cash-heavy transactions. It's a genuinely difficult question underneath all of this, and one this series keeps returning to across different countries. When police build an entire task force specifically to dismantle one organisation, at what point does targeted, intelligence-led investigation start to shade into exactly the kind of guilt by association Tyrrell was describing? The court in this case didn't find in Hewat's favour on the bail question, but the argument itself, that association alone was doing some of the work that evidence should have been doing, isn't one that disappears just because a judge ruled against it on a specific application. Bail eventually came, in May, under conditions that included a $500,000 surety. It didn't last. By October the following year, 2014, Echo Taskforce detectives were back. This time it was a vehicle stop. Police intercepted a car that had previously been spotted fitted with wheels matching those from a suspected stolen vehicle, though when officers actually pulled the car over, the wheels in question weren't on it. During that stop and the searches that followed at his Mickleham home and his business, this time described in reporting as being in Campbellfield, police allegedly found something almost darkly comic against the backdrop of everything else. Sildenafil, the active ingredient in erectile dysfunction medication, treated under Victorian law as a Schedule 4 poison requiring a prescription he apparently didn't have. By the time this second round of charges was tallied, Hewat was facing 49 separate offences, 44 of them counts of driving with a suspended licence, alongside single charges of breaching bail, possessing a dangerous article, possessing that Schedule 4 poison, handling stolen goods, and resisting police. Police had also in September that year seized CCTV footage from his son's house as part of the broader investigation. 49 charges. A man out on $500,000 bail, allegedly still driving on a suspended licence, over and over, allegedly still handling stolen property, allegedly still moving through the exact patterns that had put him in front of a judge in the first place. Here's where this account has to be precise about what's confirmed and what isn't. The Age reported directly that Hewat eventually pleaded guilty to charges arising from this period. The headline itself states it plainly. What the available public reporting does confirm in terms of outcomes: a jail sentence in the range of 10 months connected to the stolen goods matters from the 2013 raids, and separately, in March 2016, a further sentence of 1 year after Hewat pleaded guilty to 3 counts of dealing with the proceeds of crime. The court at that later hearing made a point of noting something specific, that Hewat, the Hells Angels Sergeant-at-Arms, had been committing crimes for more than 40 years. Not as a passing observation, but as part of the reasoning behind the sentence. Reporting connected to that same period describes him dealing in around $250,000 worth of stolen truck parts, plausibly linked to the same towing and haulage operation that had for years functioned as his explanation for cash police kept finding at his properties. What isn't confirmed anywhere in the reporting available for this account is a single, tidy sentencing event. One court date, one judge, one number that closes the whole story out cleanly. Peter Hewat's file didn't work that way. It was raid, charge, bail, breach, second raid, second set of charges, plea, sentence, and then more of the same pattern years later. That messiness isn't a gap in the reporting, it's an accurate reflection of how this specific offender actually moved through the system. Never one clean conviction, always another thread still running. And that pattern didn't end with Peter Hewat, it found its way to his son. By early 2025, more than a decade after the original Echo Taskforce raids, Hells Angels Australia was watching something unusual unfold. Hewat, one of the club's longest-serving and most notorious members, split abruptly from the Sydney chapter he'd apparently moved to. Nobody outside the club fully understood why at the time. The answer came in March that year. Police moved again. Weapons, drugs, tobacco and cash seized. 9 bikers and associates arrested in a coordinated operation against the Hells Angels. Investigators described the motivation behind the offending in blunt terms, driven by greed and profit. Among the names at the centre of it, Peter Skitzo Hewat, once more, and alongside him his son Beau Hewat, the same young man whose house had CCTV footage seized back in 2014, the same son who'd lived at the Mickleham property his father's barrister once tried to argue he'd moved out of, pleaded guilty in connection with a $200,000 alcohol heist. His specific role inside the club, according to reporting, debt collector. A father who spent decades as an enforcer, a son who grew up in that same house, watched police search it more than once, and ended up doing collections for the same organisation. Here's what actually sits at the centre of Peter Hewat's file, once you strip away everything that isn't confirmed and look only at what is. A man built a business that could plausibly explain large amounts of cash. He held a position inside one of Australia's most notorious motorcycle clubs, specifically responsible for discipline and enforcement, and when police finally moved on him properly, what they found wasn't one clean crime, it was decades of overlapping offending, a dispute over a dog that escalated into an armed threat against a grandmother, and words to a detective that a Supreme Court judge found could reasonably be read as a threat against that officer's own family. The first question worth sitting with is the one his own barrister raised, and that no court ruling actually settles for good. When a dedicated task force exists purely to dismantle one organization, how much of what follows is built on solid evidence, and how much rides on the assumption that anyone wearing that patch must be guilty of something? Shane Tyrrell's argument didn't win the bail application. That doesn't automatically mean the question behind it wasn't worth asking. The second question is harder, and it's the one this story leaves you with at the end, rather than the beginning. Beau Hewat grew up in a house that got raided more than once. He watched his father cycle through arrests, charges, bail, and breaches for years. And by 2025, he wasn't just an adjacent figure in his father's story. He was a debt collector, inside the same club, caught up in the same kind of investigation that had defined his father's entire adult life. What does it actually take to grow up next to that and end up somewhere else entirely? And when the system spends over a decade, from a stolen dog in Craigieburn to a $200,000 heist in Sydney, chasing essentially the same family through essentially the same patterns, what is actually being achieved in the gaps between each arrest? What do you reckon?